Yes, folks. Welcome, Left Reckoning patrons. We are back with part 2 of Rosa Luxemburg, Reform or Revolution. Hello, David.
Yeah, how's it going, man? I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. This is once again just me nodding in agreement with Rosa Luxemburg, who came to a lot of these conclusions without the benefit of a whole century of history happening that
Yeah, and
validates a
like,
lot of it.
and again, for folks tuning in, if you missed part one, I think we'll try to fill in the gaps, but you should watch part one, part two, and then we're gonna do part three as well. It's a longer text. I mean, usually we like to do these as like one bit, but it's nice to be able to do a longer text and really be able to spend some time with it, because I don't think you'd really do it service, in a 45-minute episode if you try to do all three of these parts at once.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Well, I just have to bring us back to the text, but is there anything we want to say about this one up top? I mean, if the first bit was really like a criticism of like the theoretical mistakes of Bernstein in particular, this text, Rosa starts to break down the kind of practical aspects and problems with Bernstein's understanding. And like the first half of this is going to be a continuation of the theoretical mistakes, but the last bit gets really, really juicy, and I think is very, very contemporary in its applications to modern day politics.
Yeah, and before we get there back into the text, I'll just share with folks something that a resource I found. This is both available through Haymarket Books, also Library Genesis, if you prefer to go the method. If you can't afford books, which is, I've been there. Here is this text here by Paul Freilich. I think this is an older text, I believe from the 70s, been re-released a number of times. But there's a section of it that I thought was really fascinating. A kind of as a case of censorship, that's all the rage these days. And this is actually a pretty significant example of official sort of state censorship or a threat of it leading to basically a perverted sense of our world. So there's this text here, and let me just quick search my book. I'll read here. So this is from this Paul Freilich book, and he writes, Friedrich Engels, the advisor of international socialism and devoted guardian of Marx's ideas, died in 1895. His death removed a strong obstacle to the advance of opportunism. Indeed, the mature and mellow Engels now became a sworn witness of reformist policy. His last work, and this is the thing that I found really interesting. His last work was an introduction to Marx's book on the French Revolution in 1848, Class Struggles in France. This introduction is one of the most important documents on Marx's strategy. The general, as Engels was called because of his knowledge of military affairs, argued that the old barricaded tactics based on defensive strategy of attrition, i.e. of wearing down the enemy army, had been rendered inoperable by the development of modern military technique and modern town planning. Future insurrections would have to take on a very different character and be carried out by large masses of people in a stormy offensive against military forces of the enemy. This would demand a much more intensive program of enlightenment and firmer organization of the working class than had been achieved up to then. Any toying with the idea of insurrection had to be condemned. For quite a long time, international social democracy would have to confine itself to utilizing all its legal possibilities. It should follow the example of the SPD, which had made the franchise into an instrument of emancipation. The SPD executive regarded this introduction, because of its revolutionary trenchancy, as a document which might offer the reaction in Germany a new excuse for repressive measures, especially since at the very time a bill against subversive activities aimed at crushing social democracy was pending in the Reichstag. It therefore cut out all those sentences and words in the manuscript which referred to future armed struggles. At first, Engels protested against the emasculation of his introduction, but then he submitted to the tactical considerations of the moment. Thus, it was this bowdlerized introduction to class struggles, which went into history as the testament of Friedrich Engels, a condemnation of all forms of violence and all future revolutions, and of glorification of legality, under which working class parties would develop strong muscles and ruddy cheeks and have life everlasting. Not until 1924 did Ryan Azov, head of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute in Moscow, rediscover the manuscript and publish the original text. And I'll skip a little bit ahead here to say, although Kautsky knew from Engels that something was wrong with the text, he did not know the full truth. Even Parvus adopted the Testament with its condemnation of violence as the basis of his attempts to radicalize social democratic policy. Rosa Luxemburg alone never accepted the falsified mining of the document, and she steadfastly refused to regard it as representing Engels' real opinions.
Mm.
And I mean, I think that kind of sheds a lot of light on what we're getting at theoretically with this, right?
Hmm.
She's like, there's going to be a fight. Like, and I agree with Rose's instinct and Engel's instinct that you have to follow that along and kind of force that fight, but do not get it twisted that there will come a point where this is a class struggle and there can only be one victor of that.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to put it, because again, like I think when people hear like the title of this work like today, it's really is a question of like, for most people they think the question is, do we do electoral politics or do we do insurrection?
Right.
And I think that that's like a very base way of looking at this, where it's much more nuanced and well thought out than that. Like, Rosa is coming up against reformists and reformism. But as you get into later, when she starts talking about the party and the political things that are needed, I think she would outright reject a lot of the kind of sit out and wait for things to get bad too that you sometimes see from people who sort of present themselves as like the actual spokespeople of the radical left. And look, you might not need to take it from me, but you can't take being a radical away from Rosa,
Yeah.
somebody who was literally murdered by the state in a revolution. So these are her ideas, and us
And
trying to work through them and understand them.
I think like one thing I'm appreciating about Rosa is like I think that kind of explains why our fascination. You don't even need to get into the Kennedy assassination. You get into just the way we've toppled heads of state around the globe, and it's basically for just push like Ho Chi Minh, just trying to push the general sort of like even like bourgeois political rights there, and you actually see that that is not tolerated, and it's in fact put down by force, and
Hmm.
every single like killing basically done against democracy and or in the name of anti-communism is in my like view of it basically a validation of what Rose is saying here.
Yeah. Well, I think let's jump into it because we got a lot of text to work through. Again, if you haven't watched part one, I won't tell you not to listen to this, but you probably should, because we're moving forward with the understanding that you've been with us
Yeah.
throughout this journey. But just to very generally break it down, the first part is really challenging this idea that was popularized by Bernstein, that the changes in capitalism meant that capitalism was adapting. And things like the credit system and the financial system were starting to smooth out the edges of the kind of fundamental crisis and contradiction of capitalism. And that meant that there needed to be a kind of new political strategy where, instead of thinking about revolution, you need to continue to cultivate the process of capitalist adaptation. And Rosa breaks down why that's incorrect. I think most notably with like the financial system, and I think people know this better now in 2022, that even though it seemed like a new development in capitalism, it was actually something that actually cemented many of the fundamental crises, in the sense that like if finance and credit is able to step in to sort of maybe stop one kind of lack in profitability for a certain section of the capitalist class, what it ended up doing was actually involving the entire capitalist world in one system, wherein one crisis could in one industry or one sector of the economy could create a global crisis. A great example of this is the financial crisis that we all lived through. A problem with mortgages and mortgage process, and mortgage-backed securities created a general crisis that hit the entire capitalist world, and especially hit the United States and Western Europe. So rather than sort of smoothing away these problems, the financial system actually makes them much, much more potent and worse. But there'll be a little bit more of that. So that's the first part, I think, is as good as we're going to be able to do to get started, getting into chapter three. which is the realization of socialism through social reforms. And I'll just read this first from the opening paragraph just to reset us here. This is Rosa. Now, what is the way to a social society that is proposed by the theory of adaptation to capitalism? Bernstein answers this question only by allusion. Conrad Schmidt, however, attempts to deal with this detail in the manner of Bernstein. According to him, the trade union struggle for hours and wages and the political struggle for reforms will lead to a progressively more extensive control over the conditions of production. And as the rights of the capitalist proprietor will be diminished through legislation, he will be reduced in time to the role of simple administrator. The capitalist will see his property lose more and more value to himself till finally the direction and administration of exploitation will be taken from him entirely and collective exploitation instituted. So to put that in basic terms, it's this the idea here is that through reforms, power starts to become a little bit redistributed to like the labor, to the working class, to a point, to use like a kind of modern New Yorker term, there's a tipping point, right? Where like if there's a
God,
class
no.
struggle, like eventually reforms get to such a point where like the balance of power starts to fall more into working people's hands, and the capitalist starts to slowly just become eradicated, not because again of some like push or some big revolution, but rather because of the general tendency of of capitalist adaptation. And again, we see why that was certainly wrong in 1900, and very wrong today. But where this chapter gets interesting is it's going to be a lot about unions, and we're going to get into this. But I just want to be really explicit so nobody gets the wrong idea. Rosa here is not saying that she thinks that unions are in themselves bad,
Mhm.
um, but she's saying that they're insufficient in producing the kind of results that are necessary to fundamentally change and eradicate capitalism. But let's get
Yeah.
into.
I think as Paul Freilich, I think, puts it in his intro, it basically, like, and she did get into conflict with leaders of unions for
Oh yeah,
these comments. But I think what she is saying is that, like, mainly defensive, and we'll get into some of the more like sort of theoretical reasons for that, but mainly defense of working class gains, that and with limited offensive utility.
and like look at history. So if people watched the Griscom stream this week, I talked about this really shocking memo from Janet Yellen, who was on the governor's board of the Federal Reserve, is now the Secretary of Treasury, where she's arguing in favor of Greenspan's arguments that workers have become so precarious that the traditional view on unemployment, that you had to keep unemployment at a certain rate before inflationary pressure started to hit the economy, had declined, and basically workers are so beaten down in this society right now because of a lack of social welfare, because of the lack of union density, etc., that you can continue to exploit them at much higher rates. The point is that the idea that like it's just a kind of hill that you're climbing, walking up with reforms until you get to a place of socialism is just wrong. You just look at the history of American capitalism or European capitalism to see there are victories that are won, they improve people's lives, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the fundamental tension here, and this is what Rosa's getting at. So, anyways, so Schmidt argues that there's this progressive disappearance of the capitalist class that's a potential through reforms. As these more rights are won, eventually this dynamic will shift until the capitalist becomes administrator and then eventually just disappears altogether.
Yeah.
Therefore, going back to the text, therefore, trade unions, social reforms, and adds Bernstein, the political democratization of the state are the means of the progressive realization of socialism. Um, but
I
as we
mean,
were
the
just
high. I just say real quickly, like it's like we experienced the high point of this, which is like the FDR brain trust New
Mhm.
Deal era, and that wasn't lasting. And look where we are now with it, just as anarchic capitalists as Rosa would expect.
Yes, no, absolutely, and again, she's arguing that this assumes a kind of static conflict where reforms and and victories can't be clawed back, and it also like ignores the state, which we'll get to in a little bit. But to give like a Sparks Notes version of like the first argument about unions, and jump in anywhere you would like here, Matt. Like Rosa argues that workers that unions basically function to realize the law of wages. And what she's saying there is that there are fundamental rules of capitalism, just basic economy, that sort of determine the price of labor in a market economy. And what the union's doing is they're trying to push to sell their labor at the highest price. And this, again, is not a bad thing in and of itself, but
Hmm.
it's limited in its horizon. And fundamentally, some of the limits are that they don't control the law of wages, right? Labor demand in an economy is determined by the state of production, how things are being produced, how much demand is out there for labor, right? So that's one factor that's outside of the union's control. A second factor is the supply of labor, like the actual amount of working people in an economy is not something that unions are in control of. Along with the fact reproduction of workers, like more people being in society. Um, and also the proletarianization of the middle classes. So people falling from middle parts of society into becoming workers. Unions don't control that process. So their ability to influence the law of wages is limited. And lastly, um, the momentary degree of the productivity of labor, right? So these are things like how things are being produced, what technologies are being produced, what systems there are on the shop floor, right? These are all things that are outside of unions, trade unions, like direct control. So what they're able to do is through threats of like their collective organizing and action, sort of push up the price that they're paid. But again, as you were saying, I think puts it really clearly is like this is defensive, right? Again,
Hmm.
it's not bad, but it's defensive in its ability to fundamentally shift this relationship.
Yep.
Um, yeah.
You,
So
I don't
yeah,
know if I'm skipping too far ahead, but I thought this way she put it here was, I think this from, you understand why a leader of a union would take a little bit of exception to this, but it does strike at something that seems kind of true. It amounts to a cartel of the workers and entrepreneurs in a common stand against the consumer and especially rival entrepreneurs.
yeah. Well, this is also one thing too, where it's like, especially then, and you look at in the United States, when unions aren't like the collective embodiment of like the working class; they're embodiments of particular sections of the working class, which means on the level of like society, which means on the level of politics, these things can get muddied. And you see this, there's labor conflicts all the time, different unions and groups, like they're in conflict with each other because they are all attached to the similar kind of mechanism. So since unions aren't able to change the law of wages, all they can do is maximize the share that's going to workers. Now, others argue that maybe this will change over time. This is certainly the Bernstein Schmidt position, that over time maybe they'll increase their power. um, but if you look at just capitalism as a system, the ability of the defensive kind of mechanisms that the direct interests of particular workers in a particular industry oftentimes go up against things that are we would call more progressive, right? Which is like increasing our ability to produce through like technological advancement, right? You see this all the time. This is a historical fight. Keep machines out. We don't want these kind of things, which again is a fundamental contradiction in capitalism, right? Because in a rational system, if your job gets easier, that should be a good thing. But because capitalism is an irrational system, if more and more, if machines and technology and different techniques are able to lower the amount of actual labor that goes into producing a certain amount of goods, you actually see your labor value decline. Um, but because of the particular case of certain tendencies and certain groups of the working class with this, they actually rub up against this. And again, like, this is not a moral indictment of that, right? And I
Hmm.
think trying to be very clear to people, because I feel like some folks might get the wrong idea here. It's not a moral indictment of that. It's showing that like the promise that Bernstein and Schmidt are saying is like, this is the thing that's going to deliver us there. She's making the argument is like, no, because it actually has a limit in its ability to influence the system as a whole.
Right.
Um, so yeah, trade unions can, this is going back to the text, trade unions can intervene in the technical department of production. They can only oppose technical innovation, but here they do not act in the interest of the entire working class and its emancipation, which occurs rather with technical progress and therefore with the interest of the isolated capitalists. And again, just to introduce some people to these ideas if you're not familiar with them, the argument here is that capitalism creates this perverse relationship between working people and technology. It should be something that is great. Oh man, something that took 8 hours to do could now be done in two.
Yeah.
That should mean you have more time to yourself. But because of the system that we have, that is actually a threat to your livelihood. So
And it's
that's what,
wild how that's naturalized. Like I saw a TikTok today of some janitor
yeah.
looking at a robot, sort of like mopping the floor up, and just it was just pathos. Like, right, this is a sad thing to see, but like, why? Why
Hmm.
isn't that being like, oh, well, this is like, I don't have to go mop up that fucking slushy anymore, and and the whole problem is who the benefit is accruing to from that technology.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, so like to put it simply, what Rose is arguing is the nature of trade unionism is not able to escape the law of wages. It has a conservative view on innovation and tech, and it has a particularist view compared to the rest of the working class in its desire to sell the commodities produced at the highest price, same as the capitalists. Um, Even more like clearly, unions increase wages and might be able to get more time off. But they're just not set up to regulate and control production. And keep that in your head because that becomes really important later for the arguments that Rosa makes about the use of unions, about the use of a political party. Um, and, um, she talks about things like, why, for example, like early fixation, this makes a lot of sense from a certain perspective, a sliding wage scale, right? If people aren't familiar with that, what that means is, um, as like the profit goes up, as the price goes up of things, that the wages that workers get paid are directly attached to that. That was something that a lot of unions fought for, and you can see why. If the capitalists are making more money, why shouldn't you? Um, but if you look at like the actual history of labor struggles, it's never been able to catch on because that would mean a kind of fundamental shift in the relationship to the value that's created in production, and who it's going to. So you see that these attempts at reform that might even open up this door, you've seen them be thrown to the wayside even in the early 1900s. Um, Yeah, okay. And one, so the other argument is that and this is the one that I think the long view of history, again, really, really vindicates Rosa, is this argument that Bernstein and Schmidt argue that basically we will get to a point of like almost 100% unionization under capitalism. So this is why these are the proto forms of socialism. But can unions really spread in an unlimited way? And going back to the text, Rosa writes, once industrial development has attained its highest possible point and capitalism has entered into its descending phase on the world market, the trade union struggle will become doubly difficult. In the first place, the objective conjecture of the markets will be less favorable to the sellers of labor power because the demand for labor power will increase at a slower rate and labor supply more rapidly than at the present. We saw this. This is like the history of deindustrialization in the United States. In the second place, the capitalists themselves, in order to make up for losses suffered on the world market, will make even greater efforts than at present to reduce the part of the total product going to workers in the form of wages. The reduction of wages is, as pointed out by Marx, one of the principal means of retarding the fall of profit. And like this is literally the history of the union struggle across the world.
Yeah, called
Um,
it.
th- like as as capitalism started to come into crisis and the profit rates began to decline, the first thing that went were unions. The first thing that went were wages. The first thing that went were benefits. And now we live in a country where we look romantically on a previous time. So the whole progressive, kind of rosy-eyed picture that was being presented at the time was proven to just be absolutely wrong
Mhm.
in the course of history.
Yeah, I mean, inarguable.
So the other argument, though, is that trade unions and start to push for what we'll call social reforms, right? But we're talking here about restrictions on what capitalists can do to you at the workplace. Um, and they called this kind of labor legislation social control. And going to the text, Bernstein calls labor legislation a piece of social control and as such a piece of socialism. Similarly, Conrad Schmidt always uses the term social control when he refers to labor protection laws. Once he has this happily transformed the state into society, he confidently adds, that is to say, the rising working class. As a result of this trick of
Mhm.
substitution, the innocent labor laws enacted by the German Federal Council are transformed into transitory, socialist measures supposedly acted by the German proletariat. And, you know, in the same way you'd probably argue things that are happening in the American state today aren't examples necessarily of, working people enacting them versus like the state enacting them. It's doubly true of the context of, early 1900s Germany. And this mystification is really important, because going back to the text, she says, we know that the present state is not society representing the rising working class. It is itself the representative of capitalist society. It is a class state. Therefore, its reform measures are not an application of social control, that is, the control of society working freely in its own labor process. They are forms of control applied by the capitalist organization of capital to the production of capital. The so called social reforms are enacted in the interest of capital. Yes, Bernstein and Conrad Schmidt see at present only feeble beginnings of this control. They hope to see a long succession of reforms in the future, all favoring the working class. But here they commit the mistake similar to their belief in the unlimited development of the trade union movement. So here, I think, and we're going to get more and more into what the state is in Rosa's conception, but here it becomes really important to understand that the terrain of the state is not our terrain. It is not really a reflection of society. It is rather the reflection of capitalist power, and they have to influence in certain ways. The state has its own interests, but the point of, I think, one of the clearest ways to think about the state um, is, rather than maybe even like the Leninist argument that like the state is like the central committee of capital, the state operates with the goal of maintaining the capital system within the society that it's governing. And it
Mhm.
takes a long view. So sometimes it will say to the bosses, oh, yeah, you can't have kids working in your factories. Oh, yeah, you have to give people the weekend off, right? Oh, you can't have people working, this
Yeah.
long.
Like the House of Burgesses in Virginia saying, we need to stop importing so many slaves here because the demographic composition is getting a bit worrisome.
Totally. And like, and you make a mistake there in thinking, oh, the state is actually starting to take a antagonistic relationship to capital when you see that, instead of them saying like, oh, well, this is not going to work out in the long term, for the continuation of this system. So we
Mhm.
have to put in some of these things for its maintenance. Right. And this is the kind of relationship that I think is important to remember when we're thinking about the states. That the state is capitalist in the sense that like its intention is to maintain, um, capitalism, and most importantly, as we'll get in later, like the capitalist class, like the actually existing capitalist class in that society. Because later, as we'll get to, like, one thing that is interesting about the state is that it oftentimes would do things that might not even make sense in the sense of like capitalist development, but rather in the interest of like the capitalist class, like the actual individuals who own things. But yeah, she's making the argument, I think, here again is like really clear, that it's a mistake to see these kind of reforms and changes in labor laws as a reflection that like the state is now taking an antagonistic view of capitalism versus trying to make sure that the system can continue, to last.
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah, I have that. If you're ready for
yeah,
chapter 4, I mean, that's where she starts in on the
well, let's
state
see. I
stuff.
want to make sure I'm not
Yeah.
skipping too far ahead because, um, yeah, I guess this is chapter 4. Yeah, yeah. If there's something that you had else, in this chapter, I'm just like making sure we're not skipping anything important. The just because of for time, I don't think we can go into it. She like really pushes back against the kind of feudal development argument that Schmidt and Bernstein make, and it's an interesting argument, but I don't think we need to like go into understanding how feudalism became capitalism at this present moment. But again, y'all should read the text in addition. It's a very quick read in all honesty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this section, it's chapter 4 here is, I think, really great and clear and, balanced view of the state where it's like not like granting that it is, well, I'll just let her, and we can talk about it.
Chapter 4: Capitalism and the State. The second condition of the gradual realization of socialism is, according to Bernstein, the evolution of the state in society. It has become a commonplace to say that the present state is a class state. This, too, like referring to capitalist society, should not be understood in a rigorous absolute manner, but dialectically.
Mm.
The state became capitalist with the political victory of the bourgeoisie. Capitalist development modifies essentially the nature of the state, widening its sphere of action, constantly imposing on its new functions, especially those affecting economic life, making more and more necessary its intervention and control in society. In this sense, capitalist development prepares little by little the future fusion of the state to society. It prepares, so to say, the return of the function of the state to society. Following this line of thought, one can speak of an evolution of the capitalist state into society, and it is undoubtedly what Marx had in mind when he referred to the labor legislation as the first conscious intervention of society in the vital social process, a phrase
Can we
upon
pause
which
it here?
Bernstein
Yeah.
leans heavily.
She makes a move here. So she's making the argument. We can go right back to that in a second, but I sort of noted these as two arguments and making sure that we're not going on too long with straight text. Like, she's making an argument that capitalist development it absolutely does change the state. She
Mhm.
doesn't deny that at all, right? The argument is the general argument that capitalism is changing what the state does is very true. Um, but it is what its intentions are, and it's also what that change ends up meaning. And the second part here that you can just jump back into to play um, points this out very clearly to me.
Intervention of society in the vital social process, a phrase upon which Bernstein leans heavily. But, on the other hand, the same capitalist development realizes another transformation in the nature of the state. The present state is, first of all, an organization of the ruling class. It assumes functions favoring social developments specifically because, and in the measure that, these interests and social developments coincide, in a general fashion, with the interests of the dominant class. Labor legislation is enacted as much in the immediate interest of the capitalist class as in the interest of society in general. But this harmony endures only up to a certain point of capitalist development. When capitalist development has reached a certain level, the interests of the bourgeoisie as a class and the needs of the economic progress begin to clash even in the capitalist sense.
I think that's a good place
Yeah,
to
no,
stop.
that's perfect. So what is she saying here? She's saying that um, this is for people who are very well versed in the kind of arguments against the libertarian worldview that this might make more sense. But there's this kind of fantastical notion of classical politics, right? Where the early development of capitalism was laissez-faire, right? The state's not getting involved. Capitalism was able to operate under its own logic, and then the pesky state jumped in. But what the Marxists argue, and I think is borne out through history, is that eventually the maintenance of this system becomes absolutely critical to the functioning of society, the functioning of the country. So the state has to get involved to deal with the crises in capitalism and also to maintain it, right? Because you can't hyper exploit everybody forever in the most egregious, blind, naked way possible without there being some kind of rupture or break in the system. You can't deal with the fact that capitalism falls into crisis every 10 years and let your entire economy collapse. You have to put in some safeguards and some rules to be able to set up competitions so that its destructive nature is not eradicated, but it's at least managed in some sense. So there is a fusing of capital, like capitalism and the state,
Hmm.
um, that ends up happening. And what Bernstein and Schmidt erroneously say is like, well, this is a conflict that is arising. And what Rosa is pointing out is like, no, this is actually like like a high stage of capitalist development. It's a necessary stage of capitalist development for it to be able to continue. So when you see these kind of things that might say like, oh, this might be, push back against this person or push back against this person, or it might improve a little bit the conditions of working people. It's not so much that there's this big conflict now between the state and capitalists, but rather that the state is saying we need this shit to continue, and if we don't act in some way or another, it won't be able to continue.
Yeah, and I think like kind of what she says about tariffs kind
So
of helps inform the way like I remember coming up, getting the government to intervene positively in the economy was like defined as socialism,
yeah,
like back in the Obama era, right? But Rosa says like without tariff protection, the development of large industry would have been impossible in several countries, but the situation is different. At present, protection does not serve so much to develop young industry as to maintain artificially certain aged forms of production. And I think with like say Biden or even Trump intervening in the economy is like I think we all know now that that's not necessarily an actual like affirmative move towards a socialist economy.
no, absolutely not. And like putting some meat on this, like she makes the argument, as you were just saying, that there's two tensions that you see in capitalist society, that really highlight this excuse me, change. The first is the initial introduction of tariffs, and you have to have tariffs to create large industry. It just is necessary on a global market to be able to protect your domestic production, so that the accumulation can happen, so that you basically have large scale industry. Because without tariffs in that early period of capitalism, the Germans are going to make this thing better, and they're just going to completely flood the market. And your ability to make, the German chair market's really good. They make chairs cheap. They can flood the French market, which was less developed. I don't know if this is a true historical example, but this is
Right, right.
theoretical. The Germans make chairs and they can sell them for much cheaper. If the French people on the market can just buy cheap German chairs, there's no reason for them to buy French ones. So you put up a tariff, you make the cost of that good higher for French consumers. That creates more opportunities for a less developed um, industry to basically catch up, to industrialize, to
Mhm.
create the systems that are necessary to push the cost of production down, right? So that's the early need for tariffs. But what she's arguing, um, that protectionism in this period of time, and you start to see this is like free market stuff, right? Global free markets. Protectionism no longer serves the use in Europe at this point, the need in Europe at this point to create new systems of production, but rather in putting more money in the pockets of the old established industry. And like this is where I think one thing I've really taken away from rereading this text, Matt,
Mhm.
is that sometimes we talk about capitalism and it's like spiritual. You know what I mean? It's like a force, versus what it actually is. It's like a means of relating between each other, a means of relating between things. And what she's making the argument here, at least how I understand it, is that it's also really critical to think about the capitalist class. So this is sometimes where you start to see states operating in ways that like might not make sense from like a super right wing, like libertarian perspective on what a capitalist state should be doing, but they are absolutely in the interests of the particular bourgeoisie capitalist class in that society.
Yeah.
Um, and the second tension that she argues is militarism, which I found to be a really interesting point.
Yeah, I want to jump in there because that's another like kind of amazing when you look at how the 20th century played out,
Yeah.
and like the Marshall Plan era and shit like that. Like, so she writes, the same change has taken place in militarism. If we consider history as it was, not as it could have or should have been, which I just like that sentence enough is worth reading this. The same change has taken place. If we consider history as it was, not as it could have been or should have been, we must agree that war has been an indispensable feature of capitalist development. The United States, Germany, Italy, the Balkan states, Poland all owe the condition or rise of their capitalist development to wars, whether resulting in victory or defeat. As long as there were countries marked by internal political division or economic isolation which had to be destroyed, militarism played a revolutionary role considered from the viewpoint of capitalism, but at present the situation is different.
Yeah. And, they're talking here quite literally about one, producing war goods, and two, capturing markets. Like this is, I think,
Mhm.
more and more people, I think, understand this kind of more generalized idea of like a socialist or Marxist, communist um, understanding of imperialism, is that imperialism was a system of like, oh, the market's sort of stagnant. well, we can go and take over India, and introduce them to British goods and services, and obviously brutalize the people there and extract as much material wealth. So like she's arguing that like very helpful, not in a moral sense, but in the sense of like expanding the system um, of capitalism into like a global system. But the next bit, Matt, she says, if world politics have become the stage of menacing conflicts, it is not so much of a question of opening up new countries to capitalism. It is a question of already existing European antagonisms, which transported into other lands have exploded there. The armed opponents we see today in Europe and on other continents do not range themselves as capitalist countries on one side and backwards countries on the other. They are states pushed to war, especially as a result of their similarly advanced capitalist development. In view of this, an explosion is certain to be fatal to this development, in the sense that it must provoke an extremely profound disturbance and transformation of economic life in all countries. So prescient, if we know what's coming next in world history.
And it's wild. It's like, you think like the 20th century was so different than the 19th, but actually you look back and it's like there's some certain like similarities there with, the military plays in the state, the role of the state in, like, there's no giant concentrations of capital without the state, right? Like,
Yeah.
whether you go back to fucking Henry VIII being like, oh yeah, these monasteries, that's my shit now. Like, that was the biggest expropriation of land to that point in history, right? Like the state and that's what got the ball rolling for like sending ships across the world and stuff like that. So like that it is a big repudiation of the sort of like free market libertarian style, like, hey, don't steal from people who earned that type of view of the world.
But wait, I mean, like we were just noting that like we know what's coming. There's about to be some world wars, and like a large history of conflict. What she says in that last sentence, just to be very, very clear in case y'all missed it. She's arguing that like, oh well, conflict, should be fatal to the development of an economy. I mean, like you go to war, the entire economy gets fucked up. There's a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos. People, young people are dying, right? Like this doesn't make sense, right? But she argues that matter. However, the matter appears entirely different when considered from the standpoint of the capitalist class. For the latter, militarism has been indispensable, first as a means of struggle for the defense of national interests and competition against other national groups, right? So bourgeoisie capitalists of other countries, and second as a method of placement for financial and industrial capital. And you see this is the war machine. And thirdly, as an instrument of class domination over the laboring population inside this country. I mean, what happens when you go to war? Strikes become illegal.
Yep.
Yeah. Your ability to come down a bit. Well, we're out of war. This is not a time to be fighting amongst each other. We have to go and fight the French. So this is one of the things too, where it's like, not only do we have when you start reading more Marxist texts, I think, this becomes really clear. It's not that the moral perspective, it doesn't matter. I mean, these people are people who are fighting against the immorality of their world, but it also creates like an irrational and destructive and vampiric system where it's actually in the benefit, in the wishes of a certain class in society, and that just happens to be the class that's in control of society, to lose tremendous amounts of life, create tremendous amounts of destruction, and it benefits them. That's not a world that you should want to live in. So, again, and remember, when we're talking about war, we're talking about states. So again, this progressive fusion of society into the state, right? Again, is shown to sort of be very, very shallow in the sense that no, it's the interest of a few people who stand to benefit tremendously from the suffering of the many. So going forward a little bit, in the clash between capitalist development and the interest of the dominant class, the state takes a position alongside the latter, right? In other words, the dominant class. Its policy, like that of the bourgeoisie, comes into conflict with social development. it loses more and more of its character as a representative of the whole of society and is transformed at the same time, at the same rate, into a pure class state. Or to speak more exactly, these two qualities distinguish themselves from each other and find themselves in a contradictory relation in the very nature of the state. And what she's getting at here is that, um, you know, th- this contradiction and this development is happening across many other countries. So it's not just localized to, oh, Looney Tunes in Germany are getting really warlike, right? Or, people are getting really worked up in this particular context. She's like, no, this is a crisis of the entire capitalist world right now. And we get into this fundamental tension. No longer is the state even lining up behind capitalist development in the sense of like, we need to promote national industry, we need to incorporate more and more society into the market system. It starts to, at this higher stage, it starts to, the state starts to reflect the interests of the classes that dominate that society, right? And you start to see that more nakedly, particularly in like the 20th century, that it is a certain class of the society, not the society as a whole, that the state is starting to reflect in its international operations and its national operations. So the state isn't trending towards some kind of fusion with society, but rather crystallizing itself as an appendage of class rule, right? And this is the thing, is like, there's a lot of hope. Like, think about, like, democracy is very new in a lot of these places. And again, let's not forget, women don't have the right to vote. A lot of people who aren't incorporated into the system. But there's this idea is like, wow, power is starting to come to like the society as a whole. But
Right.
ironically, or these Marxist terms, the contradiction there is at this moment, you've never seen a more naked example of a reflection of the interests of a particular group of society. So to sort of sum up this argument about like democracy and the state and all these things that Bernstein and Schmidt see, again, like, and just be fair to them, they're not over here saying like everything's great. They're members of the SPD, like they're members of the left party, right? Even though we disagree with them, I think it's important to remember that they're working out shit in a very erroneous way, but trying to work it out. It's true that the state is becoming more and more active, right? It's becoming more and more involved in the lives of people. But contrary to like the development theory that Bernstein and Schmidt are putting forward, it isn't taking that more active role, not even the further development of capitalism anymore, or the development of the country as a whole, but utilizing the increased activity of the state, the ability of the state to intervene in the interest of a particular class, that being the capitalist class. And the expansion of democracy doesn't threaten this. This is a very interesting argument that I think is borne out to be very true. It doesn't threaten this. It in fact strengthens it. And she writes, the extension of democracy, which Bernstein sees as a means of realizing socialism by degrees, does not contradict, but on the contrary, corresponds perfectly to the transformation realized in the nature of the state. And the expansion of democracy gives a lot of legitimacy to the actions of the government. This is what we voted for, right?
Right. Well, and this is what we understand neoliberalism as, like the removal of economic decisions from the political realm, right? So like that's why we and Rosa says, in this society, the representative institutions, democratic in form, are in content the instruments of the interests of the ruling class. This manifests itself in a tangible fashion in the fact that as soon as democracy shows the tendency to negate its class character and become transformed to an instrument of the real interests of the population, the democratic forms are sacrificed by the bourgeoisie and by its state representatives. And we have all sorts of examples, if you follow politics on a daily level, of different sort of parliamentary reasons, or like, actually our democracy doesn't allow that. It allows Trump to do whatever the fuck he wants to do.
Yeah.
It allows Eric Prince to do whatever the fuck he wants to do. But to do anything,
Student loans, you can't. The president doesn't have the authority to do that.
Exactly.
But when we've been living through a period where Congress is technically supposed to be the one who declares war, well, there's some interesting loophole now that the president can use to unilaterally decide that.
Exactly. Or like Congress has the power of the purse, but actually, let's let the Fed,
Yeah.
print stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's let the Fed do economic policy instead, right? Yeah. No, I mean, this is what we end up seeing across the board, and it reminds me of, I'm going to have to paraphrase it. I'm sorry, but it reminds me of something that Frantz Fanon, the great like Pan-African revolutionary, wrote in The Wretched of the Earth, that really struck me around when I read it the first time, where he was comparing some of the advantages to building class consciousness in the periphery, or like in the colonial world, versus like the core, where like when you walk into the capital, if you're living in Algeria and you see the French flag, well, that's a foreign flag. But if you're a French worker and you see the French flag, you're like, that's us, we're French. So there's an ideological capacity too, that gives the state a lot of legitimacy in what it does, despite the fact that, as we're seeing, whenever these movements come up to a place where they're trying to utilize the state in a different kind of fashion, the state starts to seize up, and it's like, well, actually, this is not a political, this is not something for the realm of democracy or politics, right?
Yeah, not like that.
And I always thought that was a really, really clear example. There's two more bits here. I'm going to just read them before we get to chapter 5, if that sounds good to you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to her criticism of their theory, the theory of gradual introduction of socialism proposes progressive reform of capitalist property and the capitalist state in the direction of socialism. But in consequence of the objective laws of existing society, one and the other develop in a precisely opposite direction. The process of production is increasingly socialized, and state intervention. The process of production is increasingly socialized, and state intervention, the control of the state over the process of production, is extended. But at the same time, private property becomes more and more the form of open capitalist exploitation of the labor of others, and state control is penetrated with the exclusive interests of the ruling class. The state, that is to say, the political organization of capitalism, and the property relations, that is to say, juridical, Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
Juridical organization of capitalism become more capitalist and not more socialist, opposing to the theory of progressive introduction of socialism to insurmountable difficulties. And again, I don't think you need to know too much of history to see how that ends up being the case. Is that what ends up being inherited by the coming generations is not a more democratic state. It's a state that has cemented the idea of property relations, the power of private contract, of private property over society, rather than being these kind of reforms being the kind of building blocks of a new socialist utopia.
Yeah, and then she also mentions the Fourier turning water.
No, we have to read that, because that's that's some literary gold right there.
So a Fourier's scheme. That's, I think, believe Charles Fourier,
French one of the utopian socialists.
Yeah, French utopian socialists, who I believe, like, I won't go into his bio, I forgot, but by means of a system of phalansteries, the water, changing by means of the phalansteries, the water of all the seas in a tasty lemonade was surely a fantastic idea. But Bernstein proposing to change the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by progressively pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade presents an idea that is merely more insipid, but no less fantastic.
No, people should read the text. We've been trying to get the juiciest and most technical stuff, because that's the crux of the argument. But she's a pretty good writer.
Yeah.
I'm keeping that in if that comes in a draft to me.
Fourier catches a lot of strays.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So now we're getting into chapter 5, the consequence of social reformism and general nature of reformism. She basically, what we've seen from both what we were just reading about, this kind of progressive reformism that Bernstein and Schmidt are arguing, and the kind of earlier arguments that, capitalism is changing, it's adapting through things like credit, through things like cartels, into socialism, are wrong. And she says, she argues basically that Bernstein flips socialism from materialism to idealism, right? And I love this bit here so much, because I think this gets to one of those tensions of like, well, why should we be reading this kind of stuff? whatever. It's like Bernstein's getting stoked on finance and all these things, but he's still a member of the SPD, and like, is trying to fight for unions and for workers' rights and all these things. What practically does this difference of opinion make? And Rosa says it means a hell of a lot. But in practice, the SPD strategy doesn't seem, in a lot of ways, very different from Bernstein's. Increase unions, push for reforms, and fight for more democracy. And again, just being really clear here, you know, the argument Rosa is not making is that we should turn our back on unions. We should turn our backs on fighting for higher wages. We should turn our backs on trying to extend and expand democracy. That's not what she's saying. But she's saying that when you come from the Bernstein thing, there's like, oh, these reforms in and of themselves are getting us where we need to be. You make a lot of not just theoretical mistakes, but very serious practical ones.
And yeah, intentional, like your intentionality is fucked.
So going to the text here, so that if we don't consider momentarily the immediate amelioration of the workers' conditions, of the workers' condition, an objective common to our party program as well as to revisionism, the difference between the two outlooks is in brief the following. According to the present conception of the party, trade union and parliamentary activity are important for the socialist movement because such activity prepares the proletariat, that is to say, creates the subjective factor of the socialist transformation, for the task of realizing socialism. But according to Bernstein, trade unions and parliamentary activity gradually reduce capitalist exploitation itself. They remove from capitalist society its capitalist character. They realize objectively the desired social change. And like, if I were to just say, if you wanted to get like the crux of the argument, it's in there, right? This is, I think, fundamental to this disagreement. Preparing the proletariat. What does this mean? This is something I go off on all the time. It's building the capacity to rule, right? So think about some of the other things we talked about, like the iron law of oligarchy. Like, what should the role of like democratic socialists or socialist politicians be? Well, in addition to fighting for things, it should also be doing mass education, right? We've made this call before with members of the squad that one thing that's really frustrating. I mean, AOC, when she was getting flack for the railroad vote, was saying, oh, there's all these things we're doing behind the scenes that you guys don't get to see. And, I was very upset by that answer because that's exactly the problem. We should be educated. Like there are things that she knows that none of us know, right? And I'm not even talking conspiratorially. I'm talking like just technically. Like you're a legislature, you understand who has power, you understand who's making the calls, all these kind of things that are happening within the state. We should know that. That's really crucial information for the class and for the movement to know. And this is one of the kind of fundamental tensions with politicians that like we should be having is like, they have a requirement to be educating, not just in the sense of like, oh, because we're worried that they're going to like sell us out, right? You could hold that conviction, fine. But the more pressing matter is that we need to be in a place where we have the capacity to rule. I mean, if you've listened to me talk about Syriza, that's a great example of that. Is like you had a class of activists who go into government, but there was a separation between them and the class, and their ability to, one, utilize the full desire of the public in the sense of like they were willing to go up against the European Union and fight for rights in Greece. They didn't have the capacity to sort of orchestrate or utilize that effectively. And, it's another example of this is something that Leo Panich, argues about the Soviet Union, right? Is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet population had been made stupid. And what he meant by that was not that, the Soviet people are dumb. It's that there had been a concerted effort to sort of depoliticize society, to not have working people feel like that politics is not only just since it's like something for them, something that they understand. Everything becomes mystified, and American society is the exact same thing. Most people are completely mystified by like the actual functions of the state, by the actual functions of society. And a socialist program believes fundamentally that working people should control their lives, as a people. And to do that, you have to cultivate the capacity to rule. Like, this is one of those things that like, this is where like when you hear like more insurrectionists or people would call themselves revolutionary socialists, like they frustrate me. And like what are some things that we like if we were in a position where we're like calling the shots, like as a group, right? What are some of the things that we absolutely should be doing in the media context? We need to be taking finance under public control and utilizing that for social goods. Do we understand that as a political movement or a class? Do we have like people within the movement who understand global finance? Right? Global financiers don't understand global finance, right? These are capacities that will be necessary. Like if you want to be in control of the machine of like the economy, control of the machine of the state, we have to have capacity within our movement to be able to utilize that. And one of the things that's so critical about, like, if there is any kind of progressive, stacking, this is like we're learning these lessons as a political movement is really crucial. So like the time in the state as a parliamentary force is a really important political education, for the entirety of the class, for the entirety of the movement. That's something that needs to happen. So the process of doing electoral politics is not so much that you think that, like, the cliches like the rich won't let you vote their money away. Of course not, right? But you should be involved in that because we should understand the mechanisms of the state. We should understand the mechanisms of our economy, so that in that moment, we're able to do it, and also so that we can understand the actual structural limitations of being able to do that under the current state of affairs.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the squad. It's also similar with the whole for the speaker vote. We can't tell you what we get in exchange for playing this way, but we do get stuff like that. That gap in understanding. I mean, this is Henry Kissinger talks about that, and like, oh, I'm a part of the privileged information
Yeah.
people, and it corrupts you,
Hmm.
and not in like a uh, like just a way you understand the world. um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And putting this explicitly from the text, Rosa writes, from the viewpoint of a movement for socialism, the trade union struggle and our parliamentary practice are vastly important
hmm,
insofar as they make socialistic as far as they make socialistic the awareness, the consciousness of the proletariat, and help to organize it as a class. But once they are considered as instruments of the direct socialization of the capitalist economy, they lose out not only on their usual effectiveness, but also cease being means of preparing the working class for the conquest of power.
yep,
So again, maybe there's a bone I'm picking, Matt, but this is one of the things that like really just infuriates me about a lot of these arguments is that there's all these people who are like, oh well, we see dead ends of engaging in politics,
yeah,
so therefore let's not do it. And no, this is vastly important. But on the other side, the people who think that all we should be doing is engaging in politics and thinking about ourselves, and
yeah,
as a competitor in like a sense of trying to do the same thing as a Democratic Party, that's wrong as well, right? She's saying these are critically important for the education, for the understanding, for the organization, for building power, for building a base. You can't fetishize it and think that's going to get us to where we need to go, but you also shouldn't drop that,
yeah.
in its entirety.
I mean, great. That's one thing that, like, I told you, like, this is the first time I'm reading Rosa in any sort of a deliberate fashion, and that striking that balance
Yeah.
is just extremely impressive to me.
I think that she finds a really great way to speak clearly on this, be a revolutionary, um, without sort of falling into some of the kind of more fantastical traps. I think sort of are big now,
Yep.
and they're and also like let's also remember too, that when we're talking about the limitations of electoral politics, SPD was a mass party. It is like it's nowhere equivalent, to like what the Democratic Socialists of America are, or what the
Right, right.
present state of class organization are. So, um,
Responsibility a little bit different there too. Then,
yeah, no, well, it's just like do you have to have that mass party and mass movement to even
right.
start doing any of these kind of things? Again, like she's not taking her subject, the kind of more cynical folks here, but I think that some of the more cynical folks who might claim Rosa, should spend a little bit of time, looking at what she's actually saying.
Right.
As should some of the people who
And I think those
are
people
straight
should
up
just,
reformists. So there are a lot of them
yeah,
in our circles too.
yeah. I think some of those people should just accuse Ben Burgess of murdering her.
Yeah, that was good. That was good. Um, Yeah. Then again, just one more line. I think we've sort of hit this hard, but um, it is true whenever a firm and conscious effort for the conquest of power, of political power, impregnates the trade union struggle and the work for social reforms. But if this effort is separated from the movement itself and social reforms are made and ended in themselves, then such activity not only does not lead to the final goal of socialism, but moves precisely in the opposite direction. She's talking here about, the reformist outlook. So just put some more meat on that. I have this next bit highlighted, unless there was anything that you had, because I think this is another really clear bit of text from her.
Yeah, I've just got the final sentence, then you can do yours. But the theory of revisionism can stand, therefore, defined the following way. It is a theory standing still in. Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. The theory of revision can therefore be defined in the following way. It is a theory of standing still in the socialist movement built with the aid of vulgar economy on a theory of capitalist standstill.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like that characterization.
let me make sure. Yeah, no. So that's the end of that chapter. But going up a little bit more, um, she says, it is true that the present procedure of social democracy does not consist in waiting for the antagonisms of capitalism to develop and in passing on only then to the task of suppressing them. On the contrary, the essence of the revolutionary procedure is to be guided by the direction of this development. Once it is ascertained and inferring from this direction what consequences are necessary for the political struggle. Thus, social democracy has combated tariff wars and militarism without waiting for their reactionary character to be fully evident. So what she's talking about there is that's like accelerationist. Like let the shit get really bad, and then we're gonna be able to take advantage of it. She's saying no, like social democracy combats these things because we don't want to see this immiseration, um, you know, increase unchecked. But Bernstein's procedure is not guided by a consideration of the development of capitalism, by the prospect of the aggravation of its contradictions. It is guided by the prospect of the attenuation of these contradictions. He shows this when he speaks of the adaptations of capitalist economy. So again, what she's saying here is that like fight against things when you have the capacity and the ability to do it, right? That's something we should be doing. That's something that we should not be rejecting. But to the Bernsteins out there who think that that fight in and of themselves, that capitalism's getting smoother, right, and we should be fighting for smooth, nice capitalism, is wrongheaded as well, because that won't get us to where we want to be. And then you look at the long arc of history, plenty of reformist movements have been successful in limiting some of the horrors of this system. But have they been successful in overcoming the system itself? No. And she's really arguing against this kind of thing. And this is, again, you have to be dialectical. You have to be able to hold a couple things in your head at once, right? We should be fighting for reforms and improvements in people's lives. That's the work of politics. Um, we also have to know that that can't be the end in and of itself, and know that we have this long goal and preparing for preparing for these things, because we won't get out of crisis, because these reforms are temporary in nature, as you've seen in the American context. From how quickly a lot of these things that are truly magnificent. Winning like a limited working day was amazing. Look at American
Yeah,
working people today and see how many people are working over 8 hours a day. A lot,
yeah.
right? So,
We're
again,
bringing back child labor in
yeah,
factories.
yeah, no. Um, so then she argues that um, Bernstein's theories fails in two ways. It's utopian in its stance on the establishment of socialism. That we're going to have this, as I was calling earlier, tipping point socialism, that enough reforms are just going to move class power into to people's hands. And it's reactionary character in that it wants to ameliorate, lessen the coming capitalist crisis that is sort of functionally always with us. And I know you read it, but just because I like thundering last words, I'm going to borrow her again. The theory of revisionism can therefore be defined in the following way. It is a theory of standing still in the socialist movement built with the aid of vulgar economy and on a theory of capitalist standstill. So I know we covered a lot there. That's part two. We'll get to part three. I'm trying to think of a way to put a bow on these arguments. I mean, I really appreciate how dialectical of a thinker Rosa is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if you look actually at a lot of the kind of like theoretical or political crises that we're facing on the left, like post Bernie unity, is people lining up on two sides of this equation, right?
Of equation that she solved dialectically.
Yeah, of an equation that she solved dialectically, right? You have people who basically are like, electoral politics is a dead end. Unions aren't growing in the way they should be because there's bureaucracy and they're corrupt or whatever. So basically, we should sort of fall out and stop participating in politics, right? Which is wrong. And then there are people who are basically like, well, what we should do is we should attach ourselves to the Democratic Party. We should fix the crises of liberalism and by extension the crises of capitalism for them, right? Socialists are going to be the unwanted heroes of liberalism. There's certainly a section that's out there that thinks that, and there's definitely a section that thinks the first bit of the argument Rosa is able to do is like, no, we have to be dialectical. This is like the point of Marxist thinking, of Marxist philosophy, is being able to recognize that reforms and fighting in electoral politics, fighting in the union struggle, fighting in the labor struggle are absolutely critical avenues of struggle, things we absolutely need to be doing. But we cannot, lull ourselves to some kind of lullaby that reforms in and of themselves are going to get us to where we need to do. We need to be like, we have to be building the capacity of working people to understand the world around them, to be organizing them as a class, to be building up militancy, to be building up the structures that have the capacity to not only fight, but then the real thing happens on the other side to like rule and govern and produce this kind of system. And I don't know. The reason we covered this is like, I think this text actually really speaks to a lot of the divisions that we have right now. And this is a moment where, thinking more dialectically and strategically is absolutely necessary. And I hope that, as a movement, we can sort of work our way out of this kind of current conjecture.
Yeah, well said.
Well, I think it might be a couple weeks before we do part 3, but we'll do part 3 as well. It's a really good section. And, if you've liked these Rosa series, let us know. I know these are a little bit more ambitious than the ones we try to do, but I've gotten a lot out of this, if nothing else. But I hope the listeners have as well.
Yeah, I think this is. Yeah, I think this one. I mean, it's funny because it's not like Capital Volume 1, like,
No.
but there's a lot to, um, jump in and sort of reflect on your current situation with. But
Well, to people who might be listening to this, if it gets released outside of the Patreon later, you should definitely subscribe. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. Help us do more of these. To our beautiful and lovely patrons, we appreciate you all so much. We'll be back on Tuesday with Matt Huber talking about, so I think actually like lining up with some of these concepts and talking about the Green Movement, what happened to the Green New Deal Coalition, and the IRA. So the Inflation Reduction Act. So appreciate all of y'all, and we'll see y'all in a couple days.
peace.